Hello, this is Richard Price. I'm experimenting with AI to produce podcasts. This podcast was generated totally using AI. These are not human voices. Please let me know what you think.
All right, everyone, welcome back for another deep dive today. We're really going to try to get to the bottom of light curing in dentistry.
Intriguing.
Yeah, it seems so simple, right? Just point and shoot.
You'd think so. But, it can get kind of complicated.
Well, yeah, like magic almost.
Yeah, exactly like a magic spell. If you don't know the incantation, the spell won't work.
And today we're going to look at two studies that really try to illuminate some of these mysteries of light curing.
Yeah, and they both really highlight the need for accuracy, both in the research and in our clinical practice.
So true. It's like a recipe if you don't know the oven temperature or the baking time.
Exactly. You're not going to get consistent results.
And that's what these studies really emphasize, the importance of precise measurements and reporting.
Absolutely. And, it's fascinating. They both approach this from slightly different angles.
Yeah. One's more of a big picture view and the other one gets down into the nitty-gritty details.
Yeah. So the one I was looking at, the Hades and Palin study from Birmingham, they did like a broad overview of research on LLT, low-level light therapy,
Okay.
which includes light curing,
Right.
So they wanted to see just how well researchers are reporting the, all the important parameters in their studies.
That makes sense. What about the study that you were looking at?
Well, the one from the Price Research Group at Dalhousie, they took a more hands-on approach.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they actually tested out different light curing units to see how they actually performed.
Interesting. So they didn't just look at the research, they actually got their hands dirty.
They did. They got in there. And I think that's super valuable because it gives us a more practical perspective.
For sure, because at the end of the day, it's about what happens in the real world.
Yeah.
In our operatories, not just in a lab.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So why don't we start with that Birmingham study? The Hades and Palin one. What were they actually trying to find out?
Well, their main objective was to see, are researchers reporting all the essential parameters in their LLT studies? Are they being thorough?
Right. And how did they go about doing that?
They did a systematic review of 74 articles that were published on PubMed. They used the search terms LLT and photobiomodulation.
Okay, so a pretty good sample size. And PubMed is, a reputable source.
Yeah, they wanted to capture, a good chunk of the published research.
It makes sense. And what did they find?
I was actually pretty shocked by how much information was missing from these studies.
Really? Like what kind of information?
Well, a lot of it was really crucial stuff, like 73% of the articles didn't even mention how they measured the light. They just took the manufacturer's word for it.
Wow, that's a bit concerning.
Right, you're just trusting that what's printed on the box is accurate.
You'd think they'd be a bit more rigorous, especially in a scientific study.
It's like building a house without a blueprint. You might get lucky, but...
Yeah, or it could all come crashing down.
Exactly. So what other information was missing?
Well, they found that 41% of the studies didn't even report the power output of the LCU.
The LCU.
The light curing unit.
Right, of course. And what else?
Well, another 41% missed out on specifying the beam area, and then 43% didn't mention the irradiance.
Okay, and what about radiant energy?
Oh, that's the real kicker. A whopping 74% of the studies failed to report radiant energy.
Wow, that's a huge omission.
It is, and it makes you wonder, how can you compare results across different studies when you have these kinds of inconsistencies?
Yeah, it's like comparing apples and oranges.
Exactly, and it's not just about the missing information.
What else?
Well, the study also found that a lot of researchers were actually using the wrong terminology.
Oh, no.
Yeah, like they were saying energy density when they really meant radiant exposure.
So it's like they're speaking different languages.
Kinda, yeah, and it shows a real lack of understanding of the basic, photophysics.
Right, and that can lead to a lot of confusion and misinterpretations.
Absolutely. It highlights the need for more standardized, rigorous approach to reporting and research.
Yeah, we need to get everyone on the same page speaking the same language.
Exactly. And you know what? The researchers in this study, they actually offered some solutions.
Really? Like what?
They proposed a 10-point checklist of essential parameters that should be included in every LLT study.
Interesting. So like a standard set of guidelines.
Exactly,
Yeah.
so that we can ensure clarity and comparability,
Yeah.
Across the board.
That would be huge because then we can finally start comparing apples to apples.
Exactly, and really start to build a solid foundation of knowledge in this field.
It's like creating a universal language for light curing research.
Precisely, and I think that's a critical step towards advancing our understanding and improving patient care.
For sure, because ultimately it's all about ensuring better outcomes for our patients.
Absolutely, that's the goal.
So having this standardized framework would really elevate the quality and reliability of research.
Oh, absolutely. It would make a huge difference.
So it's like you said before, we need that shared language, those rigorous standards.
Yeah, and I think this checklist is a great step in the right direction, for LLLT research.
Definitely. And it just highlights how important this issue of accuracy is.
For sure, it's foundational,
Yeah.
you know?
Absolutely. All right. So we've talked about the big picture view from the Birmingham study.
Right, the kind of overview of the research landscape.
Now let's dive into that hands-on study from Dalhousie, the one that you were looking at.
Yeah, the Price Research Group study, they really got into the weeds with testing different LCUs.
All right. Let's hear about it.
Okay, so they wanted to see how well these LCUs actually perform in the real world,
Okay.
compared to what the manufacturers claim.
Right. Because sometimes what's on the box is not quite what you get.
Exactly. So they got 12 different commercially available LCUs,
12.
12, and some of them they bought online.
Interesting. So not just from like reputable dental suppliers.
Nope, some from online marketplaces, which, raises some questions about quality control.
For sure. Because who knows what you're really getting from some of those online sellers.
Right. So they really wanted to put these LCUs to the test.
Okay. So what kind of tests did they do?
Well, they measured a bunch of stuff, the radiant power output, the irradiance, and the beam profile.
Okay. Hold on. I know irradiance, but remind me what's beam profile again.
It's basically the shape and distribution of the light beam.
Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, and they did all these measurements at different distances from the light source.
So they were really trying to simulate real world conditions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they even factored in the size of a molar tooth, to make it clinically relevant.
Well, that's a nice touch.
Right. Because we're not just curing flat surfaces in a lab.
No, we're dealing with teeth, all shapes and sizes.
Exactly. So they wanted to make sure their findings were applicable to our everyday practice.
That's great. So what did they find? Did the LCUs live up to the hype?
Well, that's the thing. They found a lot of variability in the irradiance output,
Really?
Yeah.
Even between LCUs from the same brand?
even within the same brand.
Wow. That's surprising.
Yeah, and some of them delivered way less irradiance than what the manufacturer claimed.
So basically, you might think you're delivering enough energy for a proper cure,
Right. But you could be under-curing the restoration without even realizing it.
and that can lead to all sorts of problems down the line.
Exactly. Reduced bond strength, premature wear, even restoration failure.
It's like a ticking time bomb.
Kinda, yeah. And it
Right.
really underscores the need to understand your specific LCU.
Right, not just rely on what the manufacturer tells you,
Exactly. You got to verify the output yourself.
or look for independent testing data.
Yeah, that's always a good idea. So this study is really emphasizing that you can't just take things at face value,
Nope, you got to do your due diligence.
especially when it comes to something as important as light curing.
Absolutely.
All right, so we've talked about irradiance. What about that hotspot effect you mentioned?
Ah, yes, the hotspot.
What did they find out about that?
Well, they found that the area of highest irradiance varied a lot between different LCUs.
Okay, so some LCUs had a more concentrated hotspot than others.
Exactly, and some had a more uniform beam profile.
So what's better, a concentrated hotspot or a more uniform beam?
Well, it depends on what you're curing.
How so? Well, a highly concentrated hotspot might not cure the entire restoration evenly.
Especially if it's a larger restoration or if the LCU tip is small.
Right. It's like trying to paint a wall with a tiny brush.
You'll get streaks and uneven coverage.
Exactly. You want a nice even coat.
So a more uniform beam profile is generally better.
It usually is, especially for larger restorations.
Okay, makes sense.
And you know what they did in the study?
What?
They superimposed the beam profiles of different LCUs onto an image of a molar tooth.
Oh, wow. So you could actually see how much of the tooth was being covered by the light.
Exactly. It was a really cool visual.
That's awesome. And I bet it really drove home the point that the size and shape of the beam matters.
Oh, absolutely. And also the size of the tip.
Right. Because a smaller tip might not cover the whole tooth.
Exactly. And it might also accidentally irradiate the gingiva.
Oh, that's not good.
Nope, could cause burns or other tissue damage.
So it's all about choosing the right tool for the job.
And knowing its limitations.
Makes sense. So it seems like both of these studies, even though they approached it differently,
Yeah, from different angles.
they're both saying that accuracy is key.
Accuracy and understanding.
Right. Understanding how your LCU works.
And how to use it effectively.
It's not just about pointing and shooting.
Nope. There's a lot more to it than that.
Well, this has been really enlightening.
Glad to hear it.
I feel like I'm starting to see the light.
I see what you did there.
All right, so let's wrap up this part of our deep dive, and then we'll come back and talk about the specific recommendations from these studies.
Sounds good. I'm ready for more light curing revelations.
Me too. We'll be right back. All right, so we've talked about irradiance. What about that hot spot effect you mentioned?
Ah, yes, the hot spot.
What did they find out about that?
Well, they found that the area of highest irradiance varied a lot between different LCUs.
Okay, so some LCUs had a more concentrated hot spot than others.
Exactly. And some had a more uniform beam profile.
So what's better, a concentrated hot spot or a more uniform beam?
Well, it depends on what you're curing.
How so?
Well, a highly concentrated hotspot might not cure the entire restoration evenly.
Especially if it's a larger restoration or if the LCU tip is small.
Right. It's like trying to paint a wall with a tiny brush.
You'll get streaks and uneven coverage.
Exactly. You want a nice even coat.
So a more uniform beam profile is generally better.
It usually is, especially for larger restorations.
Okay, makes sense.
And you know what they did in the study?
What?
They superimposed the beam profiles of different LCUs onto an image of a molar tooth.
Oh, wow. So you could actually see how much of the tooth was being covered by the light.
Exactly. It was a really cool visual.
That's awesome. And I bet it really drove home the point that the size and shape of the beam matters.
Oh, absolutely. And also the size of the tip.
Right, because a smaller tip might not cover the whole tooth.
Exactly. And it might also accidentally irradiate the gingiva.
Oh, that's not good.
Nope, could cause burn or other tissue damage.
So it's all about choosing the right tool for the job.
And knowing its limitations.
Makes sense. So it seems like both of these studies, even though they approached it differently,
Yeah, from different angles.
they're both saying that accuracy is key.
Accuracy and understanding.
Right. Understanding how your LCU works.
And how to use it effectively.
It's not just about pointing and shooting.
There's a lot more to it than that.
Well, this has been really enlightening.
Glad to hear it.
I feel like I'm starting to see the light.
I see what you did there.
All right, so let's wrap up this part of our deep dive, and then we'll come back and talk about the specific recommendations from these studies.
Sounds good. I'm ready for more light curing revelations.
Me too. We'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone. We've been talking about two really fascinating studies on light curing, and now we're going to get to the good stuff, the recommendation.
For practical tips.
Yeah, exactly, because,
Yeah.
we can talk about research all day, but at the end of the day, we want to know what to do differently in our practices.
Right. How to actually improve our techniques and get better outcomes for our patients.
So let's start with the Hades and Palin study. They had that 10-point checklist for reporting LLLT research.
Yeah, remember, they said every study should include these key parameters: wavelength, power output, beam area, irradiance, and radiant exposure.
Makes sense. You got to be speaking the same language.
Exactly. It's all about standardization, and that way we can finally start comparing apples to apples.
So we can really see what works and what doesn't.
And build a more solid foundation of knowledge.
Exactly. So what about the price study? What advice did they have for clinicians?
Well, their biggest recommendation is don't just trust the manufacturer's stated power output.
Right. Don't just assume that what's printed on the box is accurate.
Exactly. You got to verify it yourself.
And how do we do that?
Well, you can use a dental radiometer.
One of those little gadgets that measures the light output.
Yeah, exactly. Think of it like a thermometer for your oven.
You got to know the exact temperature to bake a cake properly.
Right. And you need to know the exact light output to cure a restoration properly.
So a radiometer is a good investment.
I'd say it's essential considering all the variability that the price study found.
Okay, so radiometer checked. What else?
Well, they also said it's important to think about the size and shape of your LCU tip.
Right, because a smaller tip might not cover a large restoration adequately.
Exactly. And a larger tip might accidentally zap the gingiva.
So you got to choose the right tip for the job.
Just like any other instrument you know.
And they also emphasize the importance of distance.
Ah, yes. Distance, the forgotten factor.
Because as we talked about, the radiant exposure can drop off significantly as you move further away from the light source.
Right. So you might need to adjust your curing time accordingly.
Especially for those hard to reach areas.
Exactly. And don't forget about patient factors like mouth opening.
Right. If your patient can't open wide enough,
You're not going to be able to get the LCU in the right position.
and you're not going to get a good cure.
So it's not just about the LCU itself.
It's about the whole picture, the restoration, the patient, the technique.
It's a holistic approach.
Exactly. You got to
Uh-huh.
think about all the factors involved,
And apply the science to your clinical practice.
because ultimately that's how we get better outcomes for our patients.
That's the bottom line.
And that's what it's all about, right?
Absolutely.
Well, I think this has been a really illuminating deep dive.
Pun intended.
Maybe just a little. But seriously, I feel like we've shed some light on some of the mysteries of light curing.
Yeah. And hopefully our listeners have learned a few things that can apply in their own practices.
Exactly. So if you're a dentist or a dental hygienist or anyone who uses a light curing unit,
Pay attention to those details. Verify your LCU output. Choose the right tip. Consider the distance. And don't forget about your patients.
It's all connected.
And by taking a more scientific and informed approach.
We can transform light curing from a dark art into a predictable science.
And that's good news for everyone.
Absolutely. For those of you who want to delve deeper into the nitty-gritty details, we've included the full citation for the study in the show notes. Well, that's all for today's deep dive. Thanks for joining us.